The movie begins in the present city of Budapest. Branko watches from the sidelines while his grandson David participates in a football game as a defender. Despite the young man's defensive effort, David becomes avaricious and attempts to advance, opening a gap in their defense. The other team succeeds in stealing the ball, seizing the opening in defense, and scores a goal. After the game, David pouts while his grandfather tries to console him. Branko thoroughly explains to his grandchild how he developed a passion for team sports. And as a team sport, football is played as a team. Branko then starts getting sentimental and shares a story that not even David's father knows. The old man narrates his memories back on New Year's Eve when he was still a child. His father owned a very fabulous restaurant, and many people came to celebrate the incoming year at their place. A little while later, a bunch of men show up and are greeted with cheers as they go in. It turns out that the people who defeated the Nazis were Laszlo Horvath and his professional football teammates. Branko helps his father by bringing some alcohol to the distinguished guests. Laszlo gives a small tip to the child. Later, Laszlo makes an attempt to flirt with the single women by the bar. Laszlo's close buddy and teammate Peters notices a Nazi commander watching from above and senses trouble is coming. Peters implores the football player to stay out of trouble while attempting to warn him. However, Laszlo's pride overcame his fear, therefore he was far from terrified. Hans, a young Nazi commander, arrives to welcome him shortly after. The two were having a rather passive-aggressive conversation, and not one of them was showing any kind of weakness. Hans comes up with a challenge and wager for the Hungarian football star. Hans bets that whoever manages to juggle the ball between two people the longest wins. The Nazi officer then calls everyone's attention and makes public of their supposed fun wager. He asks if anyone has a football, and without hesitation, a young Branko raises his hand. Afterward, the two teams competed. A team wearing tuxedos against a team wearing military uniforms. After a few minutes of competitive ball control, the Nazis drop the ball. Hans, clearly bitter with defeat, shoves the ball at Laszlo. After a heated exchange, Peters drags his troublemaking friend away before things get worse. But it's too late. Hans orders his men to follow them outside. The Germans then beat Peters and Laszlo to a pulp and got their revenge for the humiliation earlier. Afterward, they kidnapped Laszlo and drove off. Later, Laszlo finds himself in a labor camp for prisoners, where his rebellious spirit endures and occasionally leads him into trouble. He runs across former teammate Karoli, a midfielder, while at work. Since they're relatively fortunate in comparison to others, other men in the labor camp make an effort to maintain optimism. Other inmates are executed, made to march through minefields, placed in gas chambers, etc. They are fed little rations and forced to labor themselves to the bone. Yet all they can do is try to survive. The following day, General Ziege receives a visit from Colonel Franz Warns, the Nazi regional commander of the labor camps, who comes to look over the prisoners. During the inspection, only 29 prisoners were counted. Laszlo was beaten up in front of the colonel for his usual antics. But the colonel recognized Laszlo and instructed the officer to stop and bring the beaten athlete to his office. The colonel comes up with an excellent idea for the incoming Führer's birthday. He wants Laszlo, along with other prisoners, to play an exhibition football match against the Nazis team. But Laszlo has given it some thought, knowing full well that they are no match given their current conditions. Later, Laszlo informs the men at the camp about the offer and asks if they're in. They were all in agreement, but Karoli objected, saying there were requirements. The next day, Laszlo and Karoli bargain with the colonel to get better food for the entire camp, allow them to select players from other labor camps, shorten work hours so they can train, and most importantly, allow them to write and receive letters from loved ones. The Nazis really wanted this game to happen, as Laszlo knows, and the colonel wasn't acting rationally. Laszlo leaves the office after bluffing that they won't play. The colonel meets them halfway and gives them what they want after they successfully bluff. Not soon after, Laszlo gets to work and starts with the tryouts. He starts visiting each camp, looking for potential players. At the last camp, Laszlo starts crying when he sees Peter's fresh corpse. In the distance, he sees a camp commander learning how to play the violin from a prisoner. In the act of defiance against the present Nazi officer for the death of his friend, Laszlo recruits the musician to the team. Just as Laszlo is about to depart, He witnesses the young Branko being beaten by the same officer. The football player tells the officer that he will also be picking up the child after recognizing it. The carefully chosen group arrives in Laszlo's first labor camp later that day. With the youngster included, the colonel counts 14 heads, and they agreed on 13. Laszlo reasoned that the child was needed to deliver water for the team and clean up. The child is permitted to stay by the colonel, provided that the team goes without food for 2 days. Laszlo concurs, as was to be expected. A few days later, the colonel tells Laszlo and his group that even with their special treatment, they will still be handled like inmates. Any escape attempt will result in execution, and Laszlo will be held responsible for any wrongdoing of its members. Afterward, the team gets to work by clearing out a nearby field, setting up a goal post, and start practicing. Subsequently, General Zeege visits the camp to monitor the opposing team's practice. The colonel assures his superior that Laszlo and his lackeys will lose in the upcoming match. While observing, the general sees Sander Steckley, husband to his favorite opera singer, Magda Steckley. In the present, Branko tells his grandchild that he often feels guilty about being the only member of his family to have survived back then. After then, Branko resumes his tale. Sander receives a call at the camp's colonel's office. The colonel then gives Sander a letter and says that the general is immensely fond of his wife. Sander was given the option to sign a release paper and be free, but he chose to play for the team. The individual continued to zone out later in practice, obviously not in the right frame of mind. Sander quickly comes to regret his choice and flees into the night, but the man was shot dead before he could go too far. At the same time, his wife's opera performance ended. The following day, the colonel gets infuriated at Laszlo for Sander's death and decides to retract all of their privileges until the match. Laszlo has no choice but to work with what he has at his disposal. Later that night, Laszlo briefs his team on the game plan. The plan is to let the Nazis have their way of attacking. He knows full well that they are the better team, but they are inexperienced. The Nazis expect the Hungarians to lose and will push for a goal. All they have to do is to defend and wait for an opportunity to strike back. And so, for the following days, the team has only been practicing defending. Meanwhile, Branko helps the team by handing them water every practice and supporting them on the sidelines. As days passed, they also got close to one another, which is the most important part. Trust builds a team, and football is a team sport. The day of the match has finally come. The prisoners are escorted to the large football stadium. On the way, the team got real quiet while listening to the musician play the violin. Soon, Laszlo's team arrived at the giant stadium. It was packed with thousands of Nazi soldiers and a few Hungarian locals to commemorate the birthday of Adolf Hitler by watching a football match. Laszlo and the others were escorted to their locker room and were quite surprised to see fresh towels and soap to wash with for the first time in a long time. After showering, they wore their jerseys and cleats. Then the colonel pays them a visit to see how they are faring. After the colonel left, Laszlo encouraged his team by giving a heartful speech that they could beat the Nazis. As they got to the field, Laszlo's team was met with boos from the Nazi crowd. Still, a few of Hungarians were there, supporting Laszlo and the others, and that was sufficient for them. The whistle is blown to begin the match, followed by the Nazi salute. The colonel, the general, and his wife are seated at the grandstand. General Zeege commends the colonel on a job well done in setting up the function. He hopes the Hungarians will fight back and is certain that he will win. The game was slow to begin, but after a few minutes the Nazi players became more combative. The Nazis will give it their all right from the outset, just as Laszlo predicted. The Germans played rough, but the Hungarians kept the Nazis from scoring. The Nazis changed their strategy, but the underdogs proved to be persistent with their defense. With all eyes on the German athletes, the pressure took its toll. The Nazis were in a state of panic and kept missing wide. Just a few minutes before halftime, an opportunity appears. Laszlo possesses the ball and orders for a counterattack, leading to a beautiful goal. 1 Hungary, 0 Nazis. Halftime break, and the whole team couldn't stop themselves from celebrating on the way to the lockers. Back at the grandstands, the general subtlety scolds the colonel by being sarcastic. After that, the colonel meets with Laszlo in the locker room. The Hungarian football player offers the colonel that if his teammates are released, they will purposefully throw the game. At first, the colonel says no, but under pressure from the upper echelons of the organization, he grants the others release provided Laszlo throws the game. Returning to the locker room, Laszlo informs his teammates of the offer. However, the group is aware that even though the Nazis could make a commitment, they would always find a method to retaliate. The group feels unsure about their choice because there is no assurance. The second half begins as the team exits the locker room. Laszlo then stops Branko and instructs the young boy that Branko should promise to start hiding if the Nazis are still losing by the 60th minute. The young boy promises his savior. The second half starts, and the Nazis manage to take possession of the ball early and immediately initiate an attack. The Nazis tied the score to 1 a few minutes later, and every Nazi present celebrated the goal. But it wasn't long before Laszlo managed to score a goal, giving them the lead. The colonel and the general were feeling uneasy about the current score. With the time set on the 60th minute, Branko goes to the lockers as promised and finds a good hiding spot beneath one of the lockers. At the same time, a Nazi player falls down inside the penalty area, giving the Germans to redeem themselves. As expected, it's a goal tying the scores to 2-2. When Branko heard the disturbance outside, he had to return to his colleagues. The contest picks up a lot of intensity on the field. Both exhilaration and dread are palpable for Branko, the players, and the spectators. As always, the Hungarians are ecstatic. After gaining hold of the ball, Laszlo runs a short distance before launching it into the air. Fortunately, Laszlo's teammate gets a header and a goal when he jumps at the perfect moment. Nazis with 2, Hungary with 3. The group rejoices. General Ziege smashed his cigar out of rage because he wasn't happy. Branko returns to the locker after celebrating in the background. The tiny child didn't realize that it would be the final time he saw them alive. The movie ends with Team Laszlo winning the match, but after the stadium is cleared, they are executed on the very same football field they played in. An older Branko explains to David that they died because they wanted to show that they had enough of the evil that occupied them, and that it was their way of protest to their inhumane practices. Thanks for watching.